This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. This episode is intended as a kind of complement to the previous one in which Clara and I talked about Star Trek's depictions of suicide and parasuicidal behaviour. In the course of that conversation, I mentioned an interview I did last year with Dan Davidson from the Trek Geeks podcast network, talking about his own experience. Some of you might have heard this story before. He was basically on the point of ending his own life, and then it was an episode of Deep Space Nine, Captive Pursuit, that actually turned things around for him. And I interviewed Dan a while ago for an article I was writing for the Guardian newspaper here in the UK about fans whose lives had been dramatically changed for the better by Star Trek. And I just thought, having gone into this topic in some depth with Clara in the previous episode and having mentioned this interview, that it actually might be interesting for people to hear Dan's story in a bit more detail. So I got in touch with him and asked if he'd be happy for me to share the interview that I did with him, and he said absolutely, he'd love for people to hear it. So just bear in mind, this is going to be a slight reduction probably in our usual audio quality. This is just a Skype call, so you might notice a difference in the sound quality, but hopefully the quality is good enough for it to be worth listening to. And I do think it's an extraordinary story and a very inspiring one in a way. If you want to hear more of Dan's story, check out Trek Geeks. In particular, check out their episode 114 on Captive Pursuit, where he also talks about this story in some more detail there as well. But anyway, I hope you find this an interesting and engaging discussion about a very important topic. Maybe we could start off actually just by talking a little bit about how you sort of first got into Star Trek. You know, what was your kind of first exposure? Was it as a kid, as it was with me?
Yes, it was. Growing up in the 70s, I didn't like Star Trek. My older brother got to watch what he wanted, and I wanted to watch stuff like Gilligan's Island and Brady Bunch, but he was the older kid, so we got to watch Star Trek when dinner was on and after dinner. So I kind of didn't like it, but as I was forced to watch it, it grew on me, and I really started to appreciate it and love it, and looked forward to watching it as often as possible.
And so was that, when were you born, if you don't mind me asking?
I was born in 1969. So it was, okay, fine. I was born a week after the final episode aired, I believe. I have to double check that, but 1969, and I think I started watching it with a passion 1977, 76, somewhere around there, right around the time the first movie came out, actually.
Ah, right. Okay, fine. So it was original series reruns. That was your Star Trek, even if
absolutely, and it was my Star Trek right up into the mid '80s. Of course, with everybody else, with just having movies, it's a little different. Not having something to look at all the time at home, having to wait for the movie to come out every several years was kind of a drag. So it was just the reruns. Eventually, in the '80s, with the invention of VHS, I started collecting episodes on tape, so I'd have them all the time playing.
And then you watched Next Gen sort of right from the start?
It was actually in college in Colorado. when the premiere was on, and I didn't have a TV in my room, but a friend of mine did, so we all gathered in her room and watched the first episode. I very distinctly remember sitting on the floor looking up at the TV when it was on, and was not impressed.
Really?
But that too grew on me.
Fair enough. Yeah. You didn't kind of abandon ship anyway. You stuck with it long enough to get into DS9, presumably, when that was first showing as well.
Yeah, I grew to love TNG very quickly. Of course, when all of the announcements for new shows came out with, DS9 and then Voyager and Enterprise, I was very, very excited. Deep Space Nine took me a season to really get into also. I really liked TNG where it had gone in the seasons up to Deep Space Nine starting, but season one's kind of slow. There's some episodes in that first season that aren't great, but as with a lot of the Star Trek series, it takes a season to get to get their feet, so to speak, and then it really took off. It became my all-time favorite right away. And of course, with the events that took place with me, it's got a very special place as my favorite.
I bet. No, absolutely. And I mean, ironically, I guess the fact that it was actually a very early episode that played that kind of key role for you. I mean, do you remember watching Captive Pursuit kind of first time round? Do you remember, did it stand out to you at the time, or is it only
I don't think it did, but because it has such strong meaning because of what happened when I was watching it on a videotape that particular night, that kind of clouds anything from beforehand on what I remember about it. This is kind of vaguely remembering. I used to be a flight attendant, and I flew to South Africa from Washington Dulles Airport for about a year and a half or so. And I do remember that it was on television at my hotel in Johannesburg, South Africa at one point. That's the only other real memory I have about that episode prior to the events that took place in 2000.
So it was 2000, was it? That's when we were talking. So how old would you have been then? Sort of early 30s? Is that right?
31.
31, right, okay.
Maybe probably still 30 plus. I don't think I turned 31 yet.
And what were you doing? What was your job then?
I was in IT also. I had a couple of starting positions in IT in the early 90s. And I was well into my career at that point, working for a large firm at that point as an IT specialist, as I am today. I'm an IT professional now as well.
And where was that?
It was in Merrimack, New Hampshire. I lived in Nashville at the time. And I actually met my podcast partner, Bill, at Trek Geeks through this company. We met when we were working in the same department, and our friendship was actually born out of the love of Star Trek that we had at the time. I had Star Trek memorabilia on my desk when he started. I started just a little bit before him, and when he saw that stuff on my desk, we kind of hit it off, and here we are 25 years later.
So you were working in IT. You were married, is that right?
I was married at the time to somebody else, and had some pretty devastating stuff happen to me in late '99, which bled into 2000, which started the whole process of what happened with me and Captive Pursuit.
And you don't have to go into all the details if you don't want to. But, I mean, sort of broadly speaking, I think you said you lost your job, or you left your job. I mean, what were the kind of...
Yeah, I won't get into the specific details of what happened because I like to focus on the fact that Star Trek actually saved me from the tough times. But it was, looking back in retrospect, I didn't kill anybody. I wasn't involved in drugs. I didn't commit a felony or any of that stuff. But I acted stupidly, and it caused some pretty strong ramifications and ripples in my life. I did have to leave my job as a result of it because it was kind of a public incident. I ended up no longer being married pretty much as a result of that, which turned out to be a very positive thing in retrospect. And based on everything that happened with civil action and so forth, I had to actually sell the house I was living in so that I could help to pay off that civil judgment. So everything was pretty terrible. The relationship that I was in at the time was a very controlled one. So when I was going through my difficult times and really needed help and needed support and family, I was pretty much forced not to be able to do that. It was just me and my partner at the time. And instead of any comfort and, we'll get through this, it was, you've ruined our lives. You've ruined my life. I can't believe you did this. And that really starts to weigh on you, excuse me, when you're going through a very tough time. And
so so your work situation was kind of up in the air, or you'd already left, I guess, by that point, and your marriage was kind of on the rocks, I guess, by the sounds of it.
Yep.
As a result of it as well. And what your partner was preventing you from getting in touch with your family, basically, for support. Is that what?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The incident that took place was very family related. And I needed to have that support from them. And I just was unable to get it. Right. So if you can imagine when things are really, really bad and you think that there's never going to be anything to get better, you're literally in a room, shades closed all day long, thinking about what happened, and it just snowballs and gets worse and worse. And then you're getting that you've ruined everything constantly being thrown at you, which makes you feel even worse. I had the guilt of what had happened already, and that just amplified it. And it just got to the point where I couldn't take it anymore.
You'd let people down, kind of thing. I mean, you'd let your family down as well as your wife.
Absolutely correct.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Duncan, I was raised the right way by my parents. I was told, always respect people. IDIC, which I didn't really understand when I was a kid, of course. I was taught always accept people for who they are. Always do the right thing to people, always be the better person. And in the incident that happened, I wasn't. I took advantage of that knowledge and kind of threw it out the window for a brief moment, which caused a avalanche of problems.
So was this a work thing, or it was a personal thing?
No, it's a personal thing. I can get into a little bit of detail. It might help shed a little bit of light on the incident. My father was a political figure in the town that I lived in at the time. And he had been an alderman in the city for 20 plus years. He had run for mayor and was mayor of the city, and he ran for re-election. And as with any political figure, there's going to be people that don't agree with him and aren't going to like the way he does things. And there was a particular individual who was very vocal about the way he did not like what my dad did as mayor. And when re-election came around, my father was defeated by a very small amount of votes. And that night, this particular gentleman was quoted in the paper saying some things that I really didn't like. And instead of just putting it in my back pocket and saying that's what happens, I reacted to it. And the way I reacted was by attacking his religion. And I did it publicly. And it caused a firestorm. And it was a deserved firestorm. I did something that was abhorrent and disgusting, and I never have felt that I didn't deserve it. I've always felt that I deserve what happened because I was taught not to do that, and I did it anyway.
Had you been brought up with a religious faith yourself, or not?
Yes, it was not one that it wasn't powerful, like we have to do these things a certain way, but we did have a religious segment to the family. Went to church every week and went to CCD when I was young to learn about all the things in the Bible, this, that, and the other thing. And I carry religion in my heart, which is another reason why what happened is so vile to me, is because I was taught from my parents and through growing up with being with having the church in my life, that these are things that you don't do. But sometimes we lose our way, I guess is the best way to put it. And I lost my way, and I did the exact opposite of what I would do 999,999 times out of a million.
Sure. Yeah. And what, it kind of snowballed, it got picked up in the press, or, I mean, what was the impact? It kind of, people found out about it anyway.
It certainly got picked up in the press. It became a headline story. I was eventually charged with a misdemeanor, and had to go to court for that. And that
having said this inappropriate thing.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
The way that I had said this inappropriate thing was by way of anonymously sending an email, which was traced, which I totally understand. And when I was brought to the police to be questioned about it, I immediately told them, yes, it was me. I'm not going to hide anything. There's no reason to. So it did become public. There was a trial, so that was public. That was in the paper. So I was getting phone calls and crank calls and all kinds of things like that. And of course, my work heard about it, and it's very something public like that. It certainly makes sense that you don't want somebody who's going through something that public associated with the company you work with. So they asked me to resign, which I did. I felt it was the right thing to do.
Right. Yeah, and your father presumably must have. I mean, when you said you felt you were letting people down, I guess that being the situation, you must have felt you were kind of letting yourself down in that you did the wrong thing, but also letting your father down if you were sort of doing it on his behalf. Do you know what I mean? And it's not what he would have wanted.
You know what?
Right?
One of the things that bothers me to this day, and it's been 20 years, is I've always felt that Dad feels that it was his fault in some way, which is something I would never want him to think. He's always been in the political spotlight in our hometown, and growing up as kids, he always stressed that he was sorry that we'd go to school and kids would be yelling at us because their parents didn't agree with something that he was doing when he was alderman, president of the board or whatnot. So he's always had that kind of burden on his shoulders that he thinks that he hurt us in some way, which he never did. So when this happened, I think he really felt that it was over the top his fault, which it was not. It was me doing something stupid, lashing out because I was mad that somebody said something about somebody that I loved. All through the time that this occurred, and after, we have never really sat down to discuss it. I think we both appreciate the boundary of it's something that I don't want him to feel it's his fault, and he doesn't want me to. It's hard to put into words. I think, Duncan. It's just a situation that took place that we both now know is over. But I think we both will always carry some kind of a burden, but I don't feel that his burden is one that he should carry. I feel it should always be on me.
Okay, so tell me a little bit. So you'd lost your job. Your wife was angry with you about what you'd done. You weren't really in touch with your family particularly. And so this is the period where you were kind of at your lowest, I guess. And you mentioned you had these old Star Trek tapes. I mean, were you watching them a lot to try to sort of give you some kind of consolation at that time? Is that what was going on?
That's one of the great things about Star Trek. It allows you to escape the world into this other world when you need to. So yes, I did do that. I was home alone a lot of the times because, of course, she worked. So I would be at home. I would not go out. I didn't want to be seen by anybody. I felt that everybody would be looking at me, and everybody knew that what I had done. You're paranoid and you're scared. So I was inside all the time. So I did have several VHS tapes because I would eventually, as the shows were on, I would tape them and pause during commercials so that I could have them saved for later. This was before DVDs or anything like that. So I would have them pretty much all the time. And like you said, things were bad. You get to the low point, and I had decided that I could not take this anymore. It was unbearable, and I was going to commit suicide. I had planned everything. I had written letters. I knew that I was going to do it. I was able to get my hands on a .38 revolver. So I had everything that I needed to end the pain, so to speak. I was up in the loft of the condo that I had at the time. I was alone. Nobody was home. The loft had some kind of customized furniture. There was a futon in there. I was sitting on the futon, and I had a bunch of stuff laid out on the table in front of me, including the letters, the gun, some pictures. And I had thrown in, as I usually do, I had thrown in a VHS tape. And this one was Deep Space Nine, and it was playing on the background. And I knew that it was time. I knew that I was ready to do it. I was crying, and I literally put the gun in my mouth. I had the hammer pulled back, and as people who have gotten to this point, because I know that there are a lot of people that have and who have not gone through with it, even as certain as you are, at least I feel this way, as certain as you are that you're going to do it, there's hesitation. And I was at that hesitation moment, but I was planning on doing this. And as I was looking up, I was looking kind of straight ahead where the TV was, and Captive Pursuit happened to be the episode that was playing at the time. And as I was sitting there, there was a scene taking place where O'Brien was literally sacrificing everything that he had accomplished in his life with his career and his family to help a stranger. He had not known Tosk very long at all, and he was willing to end his career in Starfleet, face consequences, because he wanted to help someone who he considered a friend. And he was saying that every life is important. And that was the moment that stopped me from pulling the trigger. I remember laying on the ground, curling up in a ball, and just bawling for I don't know how long. But it was that moment that episode stopped me from doing it. Things didn't get better right away, but at least I was still alive to allow them to get better.
It gave you a kind of hope, I suppose, in a way. I mean, it sounds like it was almost as if O'Brien was talking to you in that. Do you know what I mean? In that moment, they often say that, with someone who's at that point where they're considering suicide, or they're kind of about to do it. That often they always say, with someone on a bridge or whatever, it's just about getting them talking for long enough, and it's kind of, it's sort of making that, normally a human connection, but in a way, the fact that you were able to have that human connection with someone who, who you'd never met, who wasn't in the room, but who was on the screen in front of you. But I suppose maybe partly because of, because it's Star Trek, and because that meant a lot to you, and because of the kind of values of compassion and helping people. And do you know what I mean? That must have played into it. The fact that
it's amazing,
Brian doing a very kind of Starfleet thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's amazing when I've had so many years to think about this, that something that you never would expect to be the thing that helped me get through this was a science fiction television show. Normally, back then I was not aware of the suicide hotlines that they have today, and that you can get help by a variety of different things. When you're feeling this stuff, you feel that you're the only person in the world, and there's nothing that can be done to help you. It's awful. It's excruciating. And that's the point I was at. When Bill and I talk about this on the podcast, we always reference the suicide prevention hotline, and we always talk about how there are always people to help. You don't expect it to be from a television screen where the person's not actually talking to you, but in that moment, he's talking to you.
People always talk about Star Trek as being this kind of optimistic, hopeful view of the future, and I think all of that is true. But I mean, from my sense, from my own experience, and also a lot of people I talk to, I think the characters are as much a part of that as the kind of society. Do you know what I mean? A lot of it is aspirational, but it's not just aspirational for kind of human beings in some general sort of geopolitical sense. It's aspirational in terms of, like, these are people who are, who always do the right thing, whether it's easy or difficult, or do you know what I mean? It's aspirational on a kind of human level.
That's what I think I love so much about Star Trek is you have that vision of the future, in quotes, I say vision of the future, that Gene always talked about. And then you have these characters that tell their stories. And these characters have problems just like we do. But there's still that aspect of the future and all and inclusivity and people helping each other that really stands out and makes the show such an enjoyable one to watch. Even when you have series that deal with war, you have the Dominion War and millions of people are getting killed. They still have that vision of being right and just. And even though these characters can have horrible experiences happen to them, they're still there for other people when it's needed. And that's what I think is fantastic about that universe.
Absolutely. And actually, I mean, O'Brien, I think, is an interesting one, because he's not it's not Captain Picard, who always does the right thing and it's kind of almost perfect. It's someone who is a bit more human and a bit more flawed, but at the same time I always remember, you know, that episode Children of Time, where they find the planet full of their descendants.
Yes.
And O'Brien has a really tough time because he's sort of saying, I'm not going to see my wife, my daughter again. Do you know what I mean? Like, he's really resisting doing the right thing, but eventually he comes around to it, and he has to do do you know what I mean? To do the right thing for the group of people, however much it costs him personally. But I think that's sort of something of the way DS9 plays that it's not easy. It's not a kind of straightforward, yes, of course we always do the right thing. It's showing that can be hard, but we do it anyway, you know.
That's one of the things I love about Deep Space Nine and why it's my all-time favorite series. I think late season 3 through the rest of the series is some of the best written television we've ever seen, because it's not what we expect in Star Trek. It's dark, it's vicious, it's war, and these characters make mistakes and they have flaws, and they are still able to give us what we expect in Star Trek with great stories that really go to the heart of what humanity is all about. That's a great example of what you said with the Planet of Descendants. He is really hell-bent about staying. He doesn't want to stay. He wants to get home to Molly, and he wants to get home to Keiko. Yeah. And then he changes his mind when he sees that there are going to be these thousands of people that are going to be wiped out of existence. It's funny you use O'Brien as the example. We always talk about how O'Brien just is the punching bag on Deep Space Nine. There's so many episodes where he goes through some kind of torturous moment or is thrown in prison or has memories thrown in his head about being in prison for 20 years. He just always is the one who gets the short end of the stick, it seems, in Deep Space Nine. Yet here he is in season 1 being one of the most helpful characters of the whole show in putting his neck on the line for somebody that he really doesn't even know.
Well, plus we know, you know, he's had a tough time himself, hasn't he? I mean, we know his backstory, and you know, it's not an easy one necessarily. Right. Just before we sort of move forward, maybe can we just talk a little bit more about the kind of circumstances kind of leading up to that moment?
Sure.
I'm kind of curious. Do you remember the point? Because I mean, first of all, to get a sense of how much time this kind of played out over. I mean, from the time, like, say, when this thing happened, when you lost your job, to being there at home on your own day after day, to making that decision that you wanted to end your life and actually going about the kind of preparation for it. I mean, what kind of, is that something that took place over a period of many weeks or months, or did it happen quite quickly? Or
everything? The incident itself took place in December of '99. Everything became public in late January, and everything was snowballing into late February, early March. So it was a span of several weeks, a couple of months, where it just got to the point where it was I couldn't take it anymore.
Okay. You know, and it felt like it was kind of not letting off, basically. It was
exactly. And again, now that it's been 20 years and I've had the forgiveness, which we can get into later, looking back, it wasn't a long stretch of time, but it felt like years were going by, that it was just that constant guilt, you know, because it was a public thing. There were things in the paper pretty regularly, letters to the editor, still getting phone calls, all that kind of stuff. So every time the phone rang, you know, you'd be nervous about what's on the other end. It got to the point where I wouldn't answer them. I have to wait for the answering machine to kick in before I would know whether or not I should answer it. You get to be very paranoid that no matter what happens, at any moment, something's going to happen to bring you down even further.
And so do you remember the point where you actually made that decision that you couldn't cope with it anymore and that you were going to end it? Do you remember making that decision and going out? I mean, you said you had to go and get a gun from somewhere, so you must have had to sort of... I don't remember the exact moment. I think just with everything that happened, it was very hard to be in the house that I was in the home that I was in, knowing that at any moment something could be said to me that would bring me down even further. And that constant pressure of guilt and wondering what's going to happen next, because you always think it's going to get worse no matter how bad it is. You just get to the point where you can't deal with it anymore. So I don't remember the exact time and point where I said I have to just do this.
But I think for me, it may have been a more spontaneous thing, maybe within a day or so, where I'm just going to go get this gun. I'm going to do it.
And where did you go? Did you go to a shop, or did you? I mean,
I knew where I could get one. Let's just put it that way. So I was able,
like from a friend or from
kind of pretty much.
Okay, fine.
And I was able to get it without any knowledge of the person knowing that I had it. So that was another
I
thing.
see. Right. Okay. Yeah. So you took it without their knowing. Kind of thing.
Right. I was able to return it without their knowing either. So luckily.
Right. Yeah. And you were, presumably keeping all of this from your wife at the time. The fact that you were kind of making these plans, and
nobody knew what was going on at all. Nobody. Not a single person. Yeah. So.
And then you wrote out all the notes. You wrote a note for her. You wrote a note. I mean, did you write separate notes for different people?
I did. I actually typed them out on my computer, which is kind of impersonal, I guess. But at the time, that's what I did. I had ones for every member of my family and my wife at the time. That's pretty much it. It's funny. I can remember I had them all kind of spread out like a deck of cards on the table. Basically, and you've seen it in movies and you've heard it. It's the I'm sorry's. I wish I could have been stronger type of thing. Basically, they weren't long. I never saved them. I actually burnt them all after everything happened. And it was a long time, a very long time before my parents even knew that I had gone through this. So far, in fact, it was only recently. Bill and I did an episode on this on Trek Geeks a couple of years ago. And it was during that time frame that I actually told my parents what had happened, because they were never aware. I didn't want to put them through that. Your parents never want their children to die before them. And I felt that with everything that had happened and the fact that I knew my dad felt that it was his fault, even though we never really discussed it, I couldn't put that on him also. And just letting him know that this almost cost me my life, my own stupidity. So it's something I never really told them until just a few years ago.
And so then after you, after that day, I mean, obviously, okay, so you'd you'd kind of come back from the brink, but you still must have been in a pretty low place. I mean, what was that process like of kind of trying to put your life back together again?
It was.
And did Star Trek have a role to play in that? I mean, did you go back to those tapes again?
Star Trek
kind of help you through that period, or had it done its job by that point?
Oh no, it was very integral in my coming back. As I said earlier, it's the place to escape to when you need to. It was my place to go to when I needed to get away from the real world. So Star Trek was extremely important to me during that recovery period. I had to go through a quote unquote criminal trial for the misdemeanor charge. I actually had to spend a week in the county jail, which I had no problem with doing. It's something that had to happen. It happened. I had to rebuild my life. I had to get odd jobs to be able to earn an income until I could get to the point where I could get back into the IT field. Very, very slow process. I moved back into my parents' house for a while after the condo was sold, and that was a very low time also. I'm in my early 30s and I'm living literally, just like they say in joking, I'm living in my parents' basement, so to speak. And that was, it was awful. It was again, I didn't want to do anything. I didn't want to go anywhere. I went to work, I came home and just kind of sulked and tried to figure out how I was ever going to get my life put back together. And this is something that I've always believed in, Duncan, and I say this to everybody when I talk about what happened. I would go through all of this all over again, knowing what the end result was going to be. And I say that because when I was at my parents' house, one weekend in particular, it was in June of 2002, I believe. I got a phone call from a friend of mine who lived in Rhode Island. I live in New Hampshire. And she was having a problem with a laptop, and she was wondering if I could drive down to Rhode Island and fix it, knowing that I I was an IT person, and I wasn't really interested. I didn't want to drive down to Rhode Island. I didn't have any energy to do stuff like that at the time. So I said, no, I'm going to pass. And she said, well, I really wish you'd reconsider. I got a friend of mine who's visiting from Maine. I'd love you to meet her. I think we'd have a good time just hanging out while you're working on the laptop. And I said, no, I appreciate it, and ended the phone call. And then the next morning, Sunday morning, I woke up and I said, you know what? I have no life. I have nothing to do. I'm feeling miserable. Why am I going to just continue to sit here and feel sorry for myself? So I called her back and said, yeah, I'm coming down. Why don't you give me directions to get to your place? And I drove down to Rhode Island and got to her apartment. I think it was apartment, yeah. And the person who was visiting from Maine was the woman who I ended up marrying. And I knew the day that I met her that I was going to fall in love with her. As strange and as storytelling as that may sound, love at first sight happens, and it happened with Susan. And if all of this stuff didn't happen, I would never have gone to Rhode Island that day and met her. And we got married about a year and a half later, and been married for 16 years now.
A happy ending to a very difficult time.
It really is.
And am I right in thinking from the Star Trek point of view as well, that you were able eventually to talk to some of the actors from DS9, some of the people involved in making that episode, and kind of share, sort of give that story back to them in a way to kind of close the circle in a way?
Oh yeah, I'll tell you what. For a long time, I mean, this took place in 2000. It's now 2019, so almost 20 years. Even though, let me back up a little bit more. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to send a message, a positive message, to the person that I did this to. And I was very shocked to get a reply, and a very positive reply back. After that happened, over the course of a couple of situations, I was able to get together with this person. We spent several hours talking. I was forgiven, which caused me to break down again. I was so just overjoyed, because the guilt is something that I lived with every single day since it happened. I didn't just affect this one person. I infected a whole community, and it's something that always bothered me. So for me to get forgiveness from this person was extremely important to me, and I felt that I had come full circle when that happened, but I didn't. I've always wanted to thank the people from Deep Space Nine, particularly Cole Meany and Scott McDonald, because they were the two characters of this particular episode. Well, over the last couple of years, the documentary What We Left Behind was being filmed, and they were having fundraisers, which I was a very happy donator to. And at one point during the donation, or during the fundraising drive, they came out with a special perk that for a certain dollar level, you could have a behind-the-scenes meet and greet with the cast of Deep Space Nine at Star Trek Las Vegas during the Deep Space Nine 25th anniversary a couple of years ago. So I immediately did that, because I'm like, oh my God, maybe I'll be able to meet some of the people. Unfortunately, I was not able to. Colm and Scott were not there, but I did get to talk with several people, including Terry Farrell. Excuse me. And she was very gracious. She was teary-eyed when I had a few minutes to explain quickly what had happened. I've got a great picture of us hugging. So I thought that was great. I'm sorry, that was the year before Deep Space Nine's 25th. Last year was Deep Space Nine's 25th anniversary, and at STLV, Cole Meany was going to be there. So I was ecstatic. So I signed up for a photo op, autograph, and I was going to be able to tell them my story. Well, it turns out sometimes the actors that are going to be at STLV are only there for a certain amount of time, and it turns out his day was going to be Wednesday, which was the day that we were flying out to Vegas. From New Hampshire to Vegas takes quite a long time, and if everything went right, we would get there in time for me to be able to see him. But of course, that day we had to have mechanical problems on the plane, this, that, and the other thing. So I didn't think it was going to happen. So I was a little distraught. I was upset. But I had a couple friends who were already at STLV, knew my story, and knew that I was going to be late. So they scrambled, talked to whomever they could. And when I got to Vegas, I was immediately rushed off by a friend of mine Haley Stoddard, who's also a podcaster. She pretty much put this on her shoulders and ran with it. We got to a creation representative that had arranged for me to have a few moments with Colm. So they actually took me backstage. He was there, shook his hand, said what an honor it was to meet him, and actually then put my hand on his shoulder. And I said, so, Colm, I got a little story to tell you. And I told him what happened. And he was just, he was speechless. He didn't know what to say. I hugged him and I said, if it were not for you and what happened in this episode, Captive Pursuit, I would be dead. So you have my eternal, I will be grateful forever. He was so wonderful. It was such a moment to be able to tell him my story and tell him that just by playing a character on television, he was able to save a life, because he did. Yeah. So I thought that was absolutely fantastic. And as an added bonus, this year at STLV, I was walking in the vendor's room, and Scott McDonald, who played Toss, was at the table, and I didn't know he was going to be there. So I went up to him and I shook his hand, and I asked him if he had a few minutes, and I told him my story. And again, it was the same reaction. I don't think anybody who was listening to somebody tell them that you saved my life, it's kind of hard to compute when it's thrown at you really quick like that. But he was very gracious. It was wonderful to be able to talk to him. So I have had the complete full circle from this incident, with almost committing suicide, Captive Pursuit playing, saving my life, going through 19 years of struggle but then happiness and a great life now, and finally meeting the two specific people who helped save my life. It was phenomenal. I absolutely loved being able to meet both of them.
And that must give you a kind of sense of closure in some way on the story. Is that right? It kind of, do you know what I mean?
It does.
Or is it something that's always an open, something that's never far from your mind? I don't know. I mean, is it something you completely moved on from, or is it something that is always a part of you?
It's funny. It's not. Close? I don't think it ever will be. And it's funny because Bill and I talk about this a lot. He goes, it's time to let it go, man. And for some reason, I feel that I have a responsibility in some way to not let it go. So much happened because of it. Because of what I did. Bill and I's friendship was affected for almost a decade. We didn't see each other for almost a decade because one of the things I did was take advantage of his friendship during the incident prior to everything happening. So we felt that we needed to put some distance between us for a little while, which I totally understood. And by chance, we ran into each other at a restaurant about 10 years later, and the friendship rekindled and has been wonderful ever since. But it's always something that I carry with me. Just this morning, for example, knowing that I was going to be talking to you when I was in the shower, things started popping into my head about what happened. It used to be a daily occurrence. Every single day for upwards of 15 years, it would be in my mind. Some point during the day, I would think about it. That doesn't happen anymore. It still happens, but it's not every day. So I have moved on in a way, but I feel that I never really should move on completely because it was such a devastating part of my life. And I affected so many people that I've never even met by being as ugly as I was. It's always something that I'll carry in me because it was something that I shouldn't have done. It's hard to put into words, actually. Some people that I've talked to about it are like, it wasn't really that big a deal when you look at it. And to me, it was the biggest deal in the world ever. There was nothing that could have gotten worse. I couldn't have done anything more evil or disgusting than I did. And it's just the way, when people can never fully understand the depth of despair and guilt that somebody feels over something that they've done, which may not be an end of the world event, but for that person and for me at that time, it was an end of the world event.
But obviously, fortunately, it didn't work out that way. You were able, to move forward, and thanks to that episode of DS9 coming on at just the right time to kind of get your life back on track and get yourself in a good place again. So you got through it.
I got through it, and I really feel that there was some kind of a guardian angel that day. It's amazing that just a moment can prevent something like that happening, and there's got to be a something that helps that happen. So I've always felt that I was being watched over that day, and it's never easy to talk about this. Bill and I went back and forth for months whether we were going to do an episode on the podcast about this story. And I finally decided, you know what? It's time to tell the story. It's time to share what happened to me. And the reason that I decided to do it is this. It's embarrassing to talk about it. It brings back the memories. But if I'm able to help one person, even just one person, get through a tough time, if I can be Tosk, as what Scott McDonald said to me, which absolutely blew me away. He said, "You are now Tosk." If I can be that person to help someone else, then it's all worth it. It's all worth the bad feelings, the embarrassment, and so forth. And I've actually had one specific person sent me an email after that Captive Pursuit episode of the podcast came out, where this person thanked me for sharing my story because, as he said, this podcast episode was his captive pursuit because he was about to commit suicide and he listened to the podcast and stopped, which I can't even relate to. I can't even fathom that. So now I guess I know what Coleman and Scott McDonald feel when I told them my story. So it's all worth it. I've got the best life I could ever hope for with my wife and my family and my friends and job and everything. And to think that I was literally seconds away from ending everything and causing my family to have, thoughts and guilt or whatever. If I had done it, I was able to prevent that from happening. So there's help out there for people that are having trouble. But I'll always say that Star Trek saved my life because it literally did.
Well, I hope you found that an interesting discussion. I'm very grateful to Dan for talking to me originally, for the piece I was writing, and again for sharing that story here so I could share it with all of you. Just before I go, I thought I would mention once again the hotline numbers that Clara and I mentioned in the last episode. For anyone in the UK, the number for the Samaritans is 116123, and for anyone listening in the United States, the number is 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8255. Absolutely, if you are in a situation similar to the one that Dan describes, those are the people to get in touch with and get some help. Anyway, I hope you found it an interesting discussion, and thank you all for listening.
You're blended all right.